quite slim. It packs quite a bit of sort of historical events, and it's multi-generational. It goes across many geographies. And we start sort of in the late 80s during the military dictatorship in South Korea. We move into the sort of issues between the Seoul Olympics, between the North and South. We also dive into the repatriation process after Japanese surrender for Koreans, and also into
And
these.
forgive me for interrupting, but when you say Japanese surrender, you mean World War II?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the Korean repatriation process after Japanese surrender in World War II, and into these issues of reunification that come up at the North and South Summit, that's North and South Korea, as well as more present day tragedies like the Seoul ferry accident. And so we follow a family, the lineage of the family, including the great grandparents to the grandchildren, great grandchildren, throughout these events.
And it's interesting to me the ways in which narratives, particularly for like first generation immigrants, people who have immigrated recently and have, especially for the generation that has actual lived memories and lived experiences in their native country, those narratives are sticky and they do get passed down. And it's just interesting to read your book and to think about the ways in which those narratives affect different generations within a family, and how maybe the relationship to the narratives changes through the years, and how maybe even the narratives themselves can change, because this is what happens, right? When we tell a story over and over again, and when we get some distance from it, all of that stuff sort of mutates. And that feels like a central part of this novel.
Yeah, I think you found something really important about inheriting stories through the lives of these characters. And it's interesting because sometimes, especially those ideas that come from those stories, especially in the late 80s, those ideas were very positive. They were forward thinking, they were unifying. And you take those same ideas and you bring them into present day, they become very radical. They become something that's much more difficult to talk about. So I think it's also interesting, like you were saying, how those stories reveal to us how much we change and how the ideas that we were used to may no longer sit with us as well as our world changes around us.
So this book opens in Korea with a character named Johan, who is the father of what I mean, if you had to zero in on a protagonist of this book, I would say that it is Insuk.
Yeah.
Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing anything,
Yeah.
and feel free to correct me. But Insuk is his daughter,
Right.
and Johan ends up meeting a tragic end relatively early in this novel. And it's the political circumstances on the ground in Korea combined with, this sort of difficult fate that sets the wheels of this story in motion. Can you just give listeners a kind of overview of who Johan is and what he's up against?
Right. So it's really interesting. After writing my memoir, The Magical Language of Others, I still had my mother's parents in the back of my head. And Johann, sort of the shadow of Johann, comes from my mother's father. Johann, sort of growing up in that time, and the way he comes about to being a single father in Korea, trying to protect his daughter and also find someone for his daughter, because he sort of, based on the traditions at the time, he can't move on in a way while living in the same house with his unmarried daughter. He wants his daughter sort of settled down, living with somebody. And so he goes to a matchmaker. He looks for someone for his daughter to ensure that she'll be someplace safe if he can't always be around. And that's when we start to see those issues arise, and we meet his fate quite early.
And I mean, I don't know how much to spoil. This is the eternal question of this show. It's like how much to talk about, but I think because it happens early enough in the book, we can just say that Johann becomes a victim of political violence.
Right.
That's fair to say. And Insuk has sort of found her own match. She doesn't need her father's intervention in this respect. She's met a guy named Sung-ho
Yeah.
at university, and they have fallen in love. And then when Johann gets into trouble, like the political violence that I just talked about, Insuk and Sung-ho begin their lives together in earnest and go on to find their own fate together, which includes moving to the United States. And going along with them is Sung-ho's mother, Huran. They have Insuk and Sung-ho have a son together, Henry. So this is not just a story of one person's immigration or one person's narrative arc. This is a story of an entire family's narrative arc, essentially. And you made the creative choice in the novel to write it from multiple perspectives. This is a multiple POV book. And as the reader, you sort of get to bear witness to various individuals in this family as they comment on and experience these events as they unfold. And it gives a more prismatic and rounder view of everything, a fuller view. I mean, I think I kind of just talked about why you made that choice, but can you add anything to that in terms of wanting to make sure that multiple perspectives were represented?
Of course. And that's so I just love having this conversation with you and another writer and, you know, such an incredible reader as well as podcast host, because you sort of bring out these insights and these questions and conversations I've yet to have. And so I really enjoy seeing the novel again from your eyes, because that's such a learning experience for me. I think when it comes to the different perspectives, I I was thinking a lot about, there's another writer and researcher named Elizabeth Rosner, and she wrote this wonderful book called Survivor Cafe, and she speaks to her Jewish legacy, but also researches all the mass traumas that happen throughout the world, throughout history, and sort of brings them together to talk about how we as humanity reckon with our past. What do we do going forward? And something she said that stays with me is that our human lineage is this tenacious braid. It's a braid of both reparation and destruction. And we often see these things as opposites, but the way she describes them almost reminds me of something so tightly coiled and intertwined, and that we need to show not only the perspectives of the victims, but also of the perpetrators. And it's in her words that she says not only of the prisoners, but the prison guards, not only of and I add to that, not only the diggers of mass graves, but the bodies who have to lie in them. And so the idea of bringing this braid together was, I think, a big part of the novel from the beginning.
Hmm. And I got to say, too, that I always love reading novels by poets. And I know that you have a background in poetry, and something that a lot of the reviews of this book, all of them, I think, make note of is the compression or the concision that you are able to realize on the page, covering multiple lives across multiple decades, across multiple countries. And yet this is a 200-page novel.
Yes.
And despite the fact that it is dealing in a big time frame and is dealing in history at times that not everybody who's reading may be familiar with, I never got lost. That is hard to do. And there's something like sort of beautiful and elliptical and really efficient about the way that you move. And I'm thinking now in particular of just like that, the opening passages of the book where Johann is a boy loving the act of writing. And then within the span of a few sentences, we learn that he's lost his mother. And you just go, oh. like, man, we've moved quickly and here we are, and it's all done. I don't know. I think I appreciate that as a writer because I know that that's not easy to do. So I'd like to hear you talk about how your background in poetry and your love of poetry has informed your debut novel and the writing of fiction.
Yeah. It's so interesting that point that moment in the beginning with Johann where he's in love with language. As soon as you go into Henry's perspective, his grandson, it's almost an identical opening where he falls in love with the way he reads the valleys or the way he falls in love with his animal companion Toto. So what you found there is so interesting because it's something I discovered working on the novel is inheritance we see very clearly throughout these characters' lives, the pain, the inheritance of grief and trauma. But they also inherit such beautiful things. They inherit the love of language, they inherit the love of communication and things like perseverance. When it comes to the writing and sort of the way these things echo, the way the images almost have an ink blot quality to them, or the reoccurring eggs. Sometimes that also surprises me. It comes from maybe one of the first lessons I had in poetry, and it stayed with me so much. And while writing this novel, I'd never read so much poetry in my life. I sort of stayed reading as many poems as I could. But in my first poetry class, I had sort of walked in and it changed my life. It was the end of college. I went home that week and I wrote 40 poems and brought it in the next class. And, my teacher just sat with me and I knew that my life was going to change. But my teacher said, you know, you're really good at starting a poem and filling a poem out, but you have trouble with the end. And it's called the turn. The turn of the poem is the last or the penultimate line, usually. And the turn is sort of a place in the poem where these poems I'd written about my mother, she said, you have to forgive your mother by the end of the poem, or the poem has to forgive you for not. Otherwise, it's not a poem. It's a journal or it's a diary entry, but it's not a poem. And I think that's the first time I understood the use of magnanimity, the use of why we write to get to somewhere. And that turn, this use of the turn, I've used a lot in my poetry. I've used it for certain characters in my memoir. But with this novel, I think I used it not just for that, but for sentences, for certain passages, or the end of a chapter, or the ending of the novel. I was looking for the turns. Where are we turning on different ways in different places?
Well, and I think in both your poetry and in your aforementioned memoir, The Magical Language of Others, and in this novel, you're very concerned with the past. This is a big theme for you, and trying to make sense of your family history, the place from which your family comes, the place to which your parents returned. So we should let listeners know that in the memoir, The Magical Language of Others, you are excavating letters that your mother sent to you after she and your father had left the United States to return to Korea because your father got a job there, and left you and your brother. You were 15. Your brother
Yeah,
was, I believe, 18 or 19.
yeah.
And you guys were just sort of on your own.
Mhm.
And so I think that experience we have to mention because I think it's safe to assume you would have an interest in your past regardless if that had not happened. But the fact that your parents disappeared from your life, essentially, at least physically, when you were 15, to return to Korea, that adds a layer of intrigue
Yeah,
and mystery, correct?
exactly. That's fantastic. No one's brought that up before, but there is a very deep connection between my memoir and the novel. In a way, they're part of the same universe, so you'll see things overlap. Certainly some of the characters, you don't need to have read one or the other, but I think one gives a perspective to the other. And with my parents returning to Korea, and I didn't reunite with them for 9 years. I was an adult at that point. But I think there was a part of me, like coming to the turn of the poem, that I had to come to understand that my mother went back to Korea in a way looking for her mother, who had died tragically very young. And she was, in a sense, also a daughter, not just my mother. And that was important for me to understand as a daughter looking for her mother, and understanding what it was my mother as a daughter needed from me, wanted from me, and if I um, wanted to be there for her. So that was an important process in the memoir, and certainly helped me want to look deeper into history, into the past, and my family's personal history.
Well, the memoir is based, as I said, on these letters that your mother had written to you, which had sort of been buried, I think, or put away in a box, and then you found them later in your life when you were an adult or a young adult. And revisiting those letters was sort of the impetus for the memoir, correct?
Yes.
And
Right.
so, what it makes me think of is what we were talking about a bit ago with regard to the inheritance of narrative and the ways in which, as especially for immigrants, where there's this lived experience on the ground in another country, and then you move country, and all you've got typically are either, I guess, handwritten memories that exist inside of letters or journals or something. But more often, I think, especially for that generation, for like the baby boomer generation or whatever, the mid 20th century generation, the stories are handed down verbally, typically.
Right. Right.
So it makes sense to me that you would latch onto these letters as a way of interrogating your family's past and your mother's personal past. Like you said, seeing her not just as your mom, but as a daughter. Like you're making a generational leap there. And so then where my mind goes, and this is something that I think is sort of TBD, is the ways in which these sorts of dynamics will play out in families in the digital age. There's so much more archival information. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, think
Right.
about like, imagine having your grandfather's like social media accounts to pour over, or his cell phone records, or Gmail, or like, this is the stuff that I think kids will be looking at when they look at their grandparents' lives eventually, right? Or at least to some
Right.
extent. So it's interesting to ponder how that might change the game in terms of,
Right.
these kinds of family dynamics and how they affect people and how these narratives are carried forward.
Right. Exactly. That's such a wonderful point. I think there will there will be a lot of changes, and there might be some similarities as well, or just continued questioning. I think for me, looking into history with like a capital H, and history, sort of when you're in academia, especially in certain cultural circles, it feels really immovable. It feels really difficult to say something different happened than what was sort of state sanctioned or what is printed. It's sort of in big bold letters and nailed down. And so part of going back to history was also thinking about not the subject that I'm researching, but research in general, ways we can do this better, ways we can revisit why we say things happened the way they did. And in the novel, the characters sort of move on at times in spite of history, in spite of what people say happened or did. And I imagine that that's a continuing thing, that as we go forward into future generations, where it's not just about what we're looking back upon, but thinking about different ways of looking back upon it, considering where we come to. Yeah.
Well, I feel like this book does a really deft job. You use this braiding metaphor. What was it, Elizabeth Rosner? Is that who you said? Yeah.
Yes.
This metaphor of like the braid of history and personal history and how it contains kind of the dark and the light. You do a really deft job of interweaving these personal stories and these historical moments in Korea. And like highlighting ways in which they impacted or may have impacted the lives of these characters in the present day. I'm interested to know about your relationship with Korean history, because this is very much a book about, it feels like a book about you investigating and being
Mm.
curious about Korea and not maybe knowing. I could imagine being like, since you've never, I don't know if you've lived there for any period in your adult life, but you don't have
Mhm.
like a childhood there to look back
Mhm.
upon. You're an
Mhm.
American, but you
Right.
have what, Korean and Japanese roots, I believe.
Right.
So it feels like an investigation. And I'm just wondering about the research part of it, and
Yes.
whether or not you had like a deep understanding of, say, the 1945 sinking of the Fukushima Maru.
Yeah.
That's a historical event, which I'm imagining many of my listeners have no idea what I'm what
No
I'm
idea.
talking about.
Yeah. It's
Or the Gwangju uprising of May of 1980. Like, these are signature historical events in Korean history, and I'm wondering what your relationship to these events was prior to the writing of the novel.
yeah. That's fantastic to talk about. While I was writing the at the beginning of writing the novel, I was completing my doctorate here at the University of Washington, which was in Korean American literature, history, and film. So I was doing a lot of Korean historical research, but at the same time, I was finishing up my memoir. So I was coming on the back end of completing quite a bit of personal research and a few other projects, I suppose, but they were all going on at the same time and they didn't feel like separate projects. The novel didn't even feel like its own thing. It all felt like one big, like you said, an investigation. I just had questions about the about certain time periods and the way a Korean American can talk and speak to those events. That maybe if you're Korean, you're going to have a different perspective. If you're American, you're going to have a different perspective. But as a Korean American, what are ways in which I can find a way into this story? And, my family's history, like you said, is quite complicated, but it includes not only South Korea and Japan, my grandmother being born and raised in Japan, but also Jeju Island, which is a island off of South Korea, and in many ways is culturally separate from a long time ago, has a sort of along maybe in popular Western circles, Jeju Island is known for the sea diving women. But Jeju Island used to be a matriarchal society and has, in some ways, a separate history from South Korea and from mainland Koreans. There's a different treatment, I think. And so I was really interested in the tension not only in Korean national history, but who are the outsiders of Korean national history? Who is not included? And that includes Koreans who immigrated, Koreans who are displaced by war, Koreans who escaped or left. It includes Koreans who settled in Japan. And so those were the areas in which I wanted to understand how to look at how history affects those individuals' lives. And another thing is, my parents having grown up in Daejeon, South Korea during the military dictatorship, also falling in love in such a place where you think that's not possible, but for love to be so potent in their lives and for them coming together, coming to the States with, my mother and her mother-in-law, my father's mother, you would think that in this Korean American community in Catholic community in the Bay Area was a safe space. It was sort of the only place they can be together, speak Korean, have meet the other mothers, and have a community. But I think what you find in the novel and you find in real life is that sometimes the community is where you're hurt the most. The place that is supposed to be the most safe quickly can become the most unsafe place for you. And that was something I really wanted to ask. What is it about these communities that we, really capitalize on, but we don't interrogate enough about those who are outsiders within a community?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't help but notice how the themes of separation, reunification, with themes which factor in greatly to Korean history, contemporary Korean history, also factor into the lives of these characters. It felt
Exactly.
like they were, over the course of their lifetimes, acting out or coming to embody these themes and be kind of human distillations, like individual distillations of the broader trends and broader like socio-political dynamics that had been impacting like South Korea, North Korea, and all of Korean history, like post World War II.
Exactly. It's really, there are so many borders and boundaries, not just the DMZ between the North and South, these borders we put up between nations, but also between different communities, as well as the borders we put in within up within ourselves. And I think the idea of what happens when we cross those borders, or we let down those boundaries, is another question that the novel wants to ask.
It feels related to the title, which I got to say, for me, like putting the book down after I was done, I looked at the title and I was like, what are the liberators? Like, but I feel like you're sort of getting to it. Like the liberators
Yeah,
are people who break through these boundaries, the characters who, in these moments of courage and connection,
right. It's
realize
the
a kind of liberation.
Exactly. It's the expected form of the liberators, and the cover with the bright doves and these, it seems almost uh, like unexpected that those doves are from this whole Olympics being burned alive on a cauldron, you
Okay,
know.
okay, wait. I got to interrupt. I got to interrupt
Yeah.
because this upset me. I'm an animal lover. And I also watched the Olympics. I mean, I remember the Seoul Olympics, and I was thinking to myself, like, I don't have recollection of this. So when they were lighting the Olympic torch, there was a big cauldron at the opening ceremony,
Yes.
and there were doves, and the
They
doves.
released the doves first. And the idea was that the doves were supposed to fly away. But some of them, actually, many of them landed on the cauldron.
Oh,
But the athletes went ahead to bring the torch because the assumption was that the doves would fly away. But when they brought the torch up to the cauldron, it sort of fire zipped around, and there's a video online, but the doves stayed where they were. You could see their feet, you could sort of see their shadows thinning into blades. And so I believe that's the last time that we use live doves in an Olympic ceremony.
I read that and I almost YouTubed it, but I was like, I can't watch the doves get incinerated. It's too much. But these
You're
are the
right.
kinds of things. And these, I mean, I can imagine that was a huge, like, signature moment for South Korea. And I imagine for the diaspora to be looking back and seeing South Korea host the Olympics. That was a moment of like pride and interest.
Right,
And
right.
then to have, I mean, there's something symbolic about the doves meeting a difficult end. And when you take into account the tensions between North and South Korea, I mean,
Exactly. How the doves don't, you could continue seeing their feet, and many of the characters, they find themselves sort of torched alive in the same way. They just don't let go of the cauldron. Yeah.
well, in the acknowledgments for this novel, I'm going to read, if I may, a
Okay.
line from the acknowledgments at the end of the book, where you say, quote, "My deepest hope is to understand that even if we fail, we cannot fail so big as war. And as sure as the sun rises and the world rotates, we as humans have a chance to try again." So that's a very hopeful note. And it spoke to me and as an observer and a human being. It spoke to the present moment, not with respect to anything in South Korea or North Korea, but with respect to what's unfolding in Ukraine and in the Middle East. I mean,
Right.
I'm wondering when you wrote that line.
Uh, I the acknowledgments. It means a lot to me to write the acknowledgments. I know everyone approaches them differently, but for me, the acknowledgments is also a way to show sort of how I read the novel, to show sort of what is guiding my uh, me on the inside, what's guiding my heart, and that that felt really true, even despite all the research and work into sort of these terrifying atrocities and really awful human events. But I think what we come away with is, when when it's the most difficult time and seems most impossible to talk about things like love and hope, that tends to be the most important time to do it. Just it seems like, why are we sitting around talking about stories, talking about each other's books and memories? But that's actually the most important thing you can do. And it's something that allows the human spirit to continue on. This practice of testimony, of seeing each other, hearing and listening to each other, is such a deeply vital part of human society.
Yeah. We have to talk to one another, don't we? And we have to tell each other our stories. We have to listen to each other's stories. And we could use more of that, I think. I feel like the culture that we live in now, everybody's sort of, or not everybody, but oftentimes we're talking past one another. Everybody's kind of in their silos, like jabbering. But it's good to have actual, real dialogue and
Right.
like deeper conversations, and even if they're difficult.
Exactly, especially if they're difficult. And Brad, what you're doing and the work you do with this podcast, I think is also a big part of that practice. It's something that allows us to keep going.
Well, that's why I keep doing it. It's for me. It's not for you. I mean, it is for you, but it's for I get so much from it. I'm like, where else am I going to have like hour long conversations with people about meaningful things in the absence of like telephone interruption or other interruptions? It's just a rare set of circumstances, and it really shouldn't be. But modern life moves quickly, and there's all sorts of stuff going on. It's a very noisy culture that we live in. So I feel like these kinds of conversations are vital for me, and I think they're nourishing for people who listen, or most people, hopefully. I think it's important that people have these conversations and then also like have access to them, because they kind of cut against the grain of a lot of the broader cultural momentum.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I want to ask you about Han. And I've talked about this once before on this show, and it was introduced to me actually. And I loved it, even though it's not the happiest topic. I thought that it was something that it's one of these Korean words, and it names something that I don't think we really quite have a corollary for in English, at least not one word. But can you just, for listeners, talk about Han?
Yeah.
Because I feel like Korean history is imbued with Han. I mean, this is something that Koreans all understand and know about. It's a shorthand way of describing what I guess you would call like ineffable sadness. And considering the history of South Korea, North Korea, and all the difficulty, the post-war um, period, where you had Japan surrendering, and then there was this big period of upheaval and change. There's a lot of Han in Korean history and in the personal histories that you're depicting. But you just talk a little bit about it, its role
Yes,
in
of
the
course.
story, but also its role in your life.
Yes, of course. So Han is the subject of my dissertation. It's something I spent many, many years trying to understand, and some years putting it back down before picking it up again, because it's quite a contentious subject, actually.
Hmm.
There's a big argument against Han because it might be, in a way, sort of claiming that, Koreans are XYZ, or it might intuit that there is an inevitability to Korean sadness, to being Korean, and that this inherited grief, trauma, and sadness is a part of you. But I think for me, there are many wonderful things to take away from Han, and other ways to translate it and understand it in a way that can be useful and meaningful. Um, in a way, the way I see Han, and it's considered, like you said, an untranslatable Korean emotion, and many people translate it as a sort of historical inherited trauma, grief, sadness, a deep darkness within you, and it has a feltness. It's sort of, people describe it as a rock. People describe having felt, the history of their parents or grandparents, even if they've never experienced it through Han, because there's something within them that brings them constantly down. But I've found a new way to understand Han as a kind of gap. And that gap is the moment of atrocity. and the possibility of reparation. And that gap is what maintains Han. It's something that's maintained when we don't have reparations. There's a lack of reckoning, a lack of reparation for human atrocity and those events in your lives. And, the other contentious part of Han is that many, Korean scholars feel that, actually, even modern Korean American historians feel that it's something that's secluded to the peninsula, to mainland Korea. So if you're outside of Korea in any way, and that includes Koreans outside of Korea, not just across other cultures, you don't know Han. You don't actually feel Han. But I argue that you can. That even if, I think what makes Han Korean is that the Korean language and the history of invasion, occupation, war, um, just these horrific events and massacres gave the Korean language a sensitivity to have a word for this feeling that maybe we don't have in English. However, the feeling itself, the experience of this emotion is universal because it's a human emotion and it's a human experience. And reading authors like Elizabeth Rosner, there's another, Christina Rivera Garza is another wonderful writer who writes about the US Mexico border. There are so many places around the world where humans understand the feeling of Han. You see it in your great grandparents, you see it passed down within you. And so I think Han is many times this deep and dark place of argumentation, of history, of understanding its roots, linguistics, and so on, but I think can also be brought here and brought to many places around the world, translated so we could talk about really difficult stories. I think Han lets us talk about the really hard stuff.
Yeah, I think that's the reason I latched onto it is its universality. And I was just like kind of laughing to myself as you were talking. I was like, this is a great Korean export. I think other cultures are going to gobble this up. Like it gives a word, it gives a name to a feeling that I think all human beings have if they investigate themselves and their interiors. You go, oh, yeah, there is something generational. There is this suffering that gets passed down. And I love this visual of the gap between atrocity or trauma and some kind of reparation or even recognition and
Yes.
somebody actually confronting. I think sometimes it doesn't have to be like a national trauma, like a war or
Yeah.
some really huge like political event that causes the pain. It could be something very intimate and familial. And that happens to grandma. And then grandma winds up passing it in some way down to mom. This is the way these things get passed along. And then eventually you'll see this. There will be, just as like an obvious example, there will be like a history of addiction in a family and it will plague grandma, it will plague mom, but then the granddaughter will grapple with it and overcome it. And you'll see that maybe the gap that you're talking about gets closed. Does that
Exactly.
register? Does that register?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's exactly it. It's that every one of us, we're just, every choice we make is so important because it doesn't only affect the trajectory of our future. It changes the meaning of our past. It changes the meaning of everyone who's come before us and the things they've done. And so at times, if it might take several generations, but that's sort of okay because each of us get a chance to make that choice.
I'd say it's a natural course of things, it feels like. It feels like evolutionary. I think there could also be part of me that spiritually is like, yeah, this has something to do with like the cycle of life and possible rebirth and who knows, but it feels connected. And I imagine there might be some correlation between like the more spiritual element and Korean understanding of Han. Is that accurate?
Yeah, there are spiritual elements to Han because, well, it's interesting. I know different families can speak about it differently, but my family tends to bring up reincarnation at times because we reincarnate in many ways to deal with the issues that are left unresolved. And those things that are left unresolved keep us close together, keep us intimate. So, in a way, by closing the gap or sealing the wound, we also free each other, but we're no longer as close as we were. So there's this interesting feeling of, well, let's keep fighting because this is also a bond. This is also a
It gives us
pain
something
that
to talk
keeps
about.
us. So there, it's interesting. I think it's complex. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that is true because it not only it not only bonds you in some strange way to people close to you and like family members, but it also gives people a sense of identity. I think so many of us identify ourselves through our pain. We sort of hang our name on that, right? Like I'm Brad and such happened to me. And that's
Yeah.
how we kind of understand ourselves. And I think sometimes it's to our detriment to kind of hang on to that stuff too tightly and to be unwilling to let it go.
Exactly. I That's such a wonderful way to put it. And I feel that way even with this novel and also the books I've written. I know we say my novel or my book, but it definitely is your book. It's a piece of work that belongs to the world because that's the world that raised me. And that's sort of, that book is sort of a consequence of that. It's sort of coming out of that. And this book shouldn't, if it's the first book you come to, great, but it shouldn't be the end. This your reading shouldn't be about this book. The book should be a stepping stone to the next book and to the next story and the next memory or the next author that you find. And so this feeling of letting go, I think, is not only, personal, individual, but also in the craft process for me, constantly saying, this is not mine.
So the terrain that you're covering in The Liberators and that you covered in your memoir and that I'm imagining you've covered in many poems, the past, your family, your relationship with your parents and your mother in particular.
Mm-hmm.
First question is, do you feel like you're done? Is there more to explore? And then the second question is, where has the process of writing, not just this book, but the other stuff left you in terms of your understanding? It has to have deepened it. And I think also I've talked to enough authors to know that it is possible, at least, for there to be some feeling of genuine release from some of the weight of the past by
Mm-hmm.
reckoning with it in a work of literature or multiple works, as it turns out.
Yeah, those are some great questions. I think one thing that writing did for me something really special, which was being very difficult on the outset because it made me set writing down for a few months. I had decided at one point that maybe I could be okay without writing. So I put writing down thinking that I wouldn't come back to it. This was before the poetry book and the memoir, but I took a break, but instead I went online and I kind of tweeted out that I wanted to write 1,000 love letters to strangers. And if you want one, you just, reach out and you tell me a bit about yourself and give me a question, a struggle, and your physical mailing address, and I'd handwrite you a love letter. And uh, I still do that to this day. And I've written just over 600 love letters to strangers all over the world. And I think what that process did for me was, while writing those love letters, I came back to writing, understanding that, oh, it was never the writing that I really wanted to do. Writing for itself wasn't enough to get me to a place where I could continue writing. The writing was not the thing. It's the thing that gets me to the real thing, which was human connection.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the love letters did for me. They taught me that, oh, this is the real thing. And that just helps you get there. And so by the time I came back to writing those poems, working on my mother's letters, and thinking of this novel, it put me in a completely different place of understanding my relationship to writing, understanding what this is all for, and never forgetting that, never lessening where I'm trying to get to, which is to another human being.
Yeah. Well, but you know what? I'm so glad to hear you say that because I think it is one of the more common errors that writers make that I myself have made it's a kind of blindness to this end goal and an insensitivity to the needs of the reader. And so I think what this process of writing these love letters, which I like and which we should clarify, these are not romantic love letters. They're just kind outreach.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yes,
I don't
yes.
want anybody listening to get the wrong idea. But what it does, though, I think is, and I think working in an epistolary mode can be great in this way. And I think I and people I've talked to on this show before have noted that some of the best writing you do, especially when you're having struggles at the keyboard creatively, is in emails where you're just talking to a friend and suddenly you're liberated, to use like the apt term, and I just think that it's really important to underline that if you're working creatively and all you're trying to do is say your own stuff for you, the work is probably going to be lacking something essential. And
Yeah.
if you're stuck, it might be worth looking at your novel or short story or memoir, whatever it is, from the perspective of the reader. Like, this is part of the most vital skill or skill set that a writer has to have, and that I think really great writers might have in abundance, is a sensitivity to the needs and the experiences of the reader.
Mhm.
And I love this idea of writing letters to strangers as a way of cultivating that and learning that.
Yeah. Yeah,
So you
exactly.
got 400 to go. Is this going to be a lifetime project, or do you think you'll stop at 1,000?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I think, like you said, that this podcast is for you. I feel like the love letters have been for me, actually. That's been the surprise. And so I want to continue and just see getting to 1,000 first would be great.
And you handwrite them.
Yes, I handwrite them and then I post them. And I still do that. Yeah.
Do you keep a copy for yourself?
I don't. I don't. I
You
It's sort
just
of a one-way correspondence. Yeah.
Do people ever write you back, or do you not even put a return address?
No, people don't write me back. When they ask, I ask them to write someone else to sort of pass that favor on.
Uh,
But at readings, I have had people come and drop a letter to me at the signing table. So I've gotten some love letters in person.
wow, that's cool.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about a little bit of your personal history in more detail. I mean, we've kind of covered and touched upon it in the context of your novel, but I'm always curious how writers form. And I think maybe there's an added element of interest and intrigue when it comes to somebody who is first generation, as you are,
Mhm,
correct?
mhm, mhm.
Can you just talk about, like, were you born in the States, or did
Yes.
you
I,
were?
I was born and raised in the Bay Area, and that's where I was staying until my parents moved. And then they moved me to Davis in a house with my brother. And I somehow graduated college despite, or graduated high school despite the many challenges, I think, with eating disorder, drinking, drugs, and, attempting my life pretty regularly. But I
Attempting to take your own life?
Yes, yes, that was a pretty regular thing. Because I thought, why not? It was such a difficult time in my life, but also punctuated by my mother writing me these beautiful letters every week that were full of joy and hope and wanting to mother me from a distance. And so I was able to graduate and I went to college and I became a hip hop dancer, a competitive hip hop dancer in Southern California.
Okay.
So
I did this. I'm talking to you, and you are so like sweet and soft spoken and self contained. I was going to ask you about this hip hop dancing, because this is the piece where I'm like, wait, she was a hip hop dancer? So
oh,
that's interesting to me that you did
yeah.
this.
Yeah, I thought that was going to be my life. I don't think I was very good at it, but I was able to get on a very competitive team. So we traveled all across the state competing, all over LA, a lot of those clubs I grew up in when I was 17, 18, 19. And I just needed to get out of school as quickly as possible because I had a difficult time with school, with teachers. I just didn't understand what it was for. And it wasn't until the last year of my undergrad that I had to take. I was forced to take an introduction to poetry because I couldn't take the math requirement, the breadth requirement, because my math skills were so poor. So they said, we'll switch it out for poetry. And that was it. I went to my first poetry class, and the teacher, really took me in, basically switched my department, my requirements, helped me get an application, get my writing together, changed my major, and I was off to New York in a few years to study poetry.
Got your MFA
Yeah,
at NYU or
at Columbia. I
at
was
Columbia?
at Columbia for a few years, and I was translating, doing poetry, interning, and then left for Seattle to see my parents.
Okay. And so we'll get back to this. I got to ask you, though, because I read this about you. I think it's true that you did not speak until you were 5 years old.
Yes, yes.
That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. I think I had a lot of trouble, I think, as a kid, actually, even as a young adult, with education, with language, with communication in general. I was very, very late to speak, very, very late to write. I was very, very quiet as well. Yeah.
Well, it just feels interesting and of a piece with the fact that, well, I mean, yeah, it's like this interesting connection between trouble with language and then eventually making your whole life about language once you found poetry. Like that really was a key event for you.
It was.
Like, no, I mean, that's cool. And I think it's something that I want to hear you talk a bit more about. Like, what
Yeah.
was it about poetry that spoke to you so deeply? What did it do for you?
Yeah. It's so incredible to talk about because the way it happened was almost harder to believe. It was so sudden that my school counselor would tell me to take this poetry class as I'm trying to graduate and get out of school. But I think, I'm not quite sure, but my sense is I never felt about anything else I'd done, like dance, for instance, is also creative. It's also very expressive. But I don't think I felt that I was saying something through dance. And maybe that was me, my flaw, as maybe that's why I didn't go so far. But with poetry, something about the organization of the words and something about everyone else having a difficult time understanding what this poem meant. But for some reason, I understood it almost immediately. It was everything else that I had a hard time reading and understanding. But a poem, it was almost like I could walk into it, I could walk around it, I could read between the spaces, especially the white spaces. I could interpret it so clearly, and it felt like, oh, this is something I could speak through. And so poetry was really the place where I started thinking about saying things, that, oh, I can actually say something, and I could learn something through poetry by practicing this turn. I could make myself observe more closely, and by observing, I'm learning how to care, which is not something I knew how to do, to care for someone, to care for myself, to care for an object or another living being. And that care turns into love. And I think learning how to love was really vital for me. And it was poetry that brought me to that place.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that's hugely significant. I mean, it basically taught you how to live.
Yes, exactly.
And so you start writing poetry, you go to Columbia, you're amassing poems that will eventually form a collection or multiple collections. And at what point do you start thinking about memoir? At what point do you start thinking about fiction?
Yeah. This is so wonderful because I walked into uh, one of my poetry workshops, and my teacher said something. It felt like it was to me, but it was to everyone in class. And he said, if you want to be a good poet, write poems. If you want to be a great poet, then translate. And I didn't know what that meant exactly, but I went to the office that day and I added the second degree in translation. And that's when I started really learning how to translate and read Korean poetry and Korean prose and how I wanted to go about translation. Now, that was really significant for me, I think, in a very different way from poetry, because I moved to Seattle and I met Dami Che, who became a mentor of mine, another poet and translator. And she really showed me that when I understand two languages, when I'm translating something from Korean to English, I'm not just translating the language, I'm translating a historically non dominant language into a historically dominant one. I'm translating two languages that belong to countries that have histories, and those histories have a relationship to each other. So when I translate Korean to English, do I want to erase it completely as if it's written in English? Or do I want to make a choice, say that I do have a choice as a translator, and translate in a way so that when you read it in English, you know that it's Korean, it sounds Korean, it feels Korean, and it never erases the Korean. And so I think what translation taught me was, what are the things I want to write about? What are the things that really interest me about different languages, about different countries, about the way our histories collide? So translation was so important from that perspective. And then I found my mother's letters and began to translate them in that way, in the way that I was now choosing.
I feel like what you're talking about speaks to your novel and the quality of the prose. Like, I feel like some of that, even though this is obviously not a work in translation, but some of that translation work inevitably must find its way into your written English when you're working on fiction or memoir.
Yeah, I think there are different writers who approach this and in their own way, but when writing dialogue that's meant to be heard in English, but it's in Korean, dialogue in Japanese, but it's a book written in English, there are sort of different ways you can go about that. And I think I'm um, much more on one end in that I do want to make it sound still as Korean as possible, while understanding the English. Whereas traditionally, that's not the way to do it. Traditionally, you want to go the other way, which is you want the dialogue to sound as if it was spoken and written in English. And you might write it into the text. So they said in Korean, so on and so on. But I sort of bring it back the other way as a sort of creative choice. So translation definitely affects the way I write the dialogue, and I write many of the metaphors, even the way the you can't dance without drums, or some of these ways we use language in Korean. I wanted to bring it out into the English.
Well, I found it evident in particular in the kind of bawdy humor and the casual dialogue between like husband and wife or mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, or when is it Huron? That's the
Yeah.
mother,
Hmm.
Sungo's mother, when she's at the senior citizen center. There's a wonderful body humor that feels very much like part of Korean culture. Like, it's like you got to be like an insider to sort of know the jokes or whatever, but it's fun to read because it feels authentic. And I don't understand this notion that the proper way to do translation is to Americanize it entirely and to sort of wring the Korean out of it. Like, I don't get that. I think you can have it both ways. I think if you're
Yeah.
skilled or skillful, you can translate it to English, obviously, but you can also retain some of that texture.
Right. Right, exactly. So that's sort of a newer way of thinking about it and an exciting thing.
So, okay, so you start to do this translation work, and then this, I think, elevates your relationship to language. And like you said, it clarifies what you're interested in writing about. And then you find these letters from your mother, and then you just start writing the memoir.
Mhm.
And then at some point after the memoir was done, you said to yourself, well, I guess I'll try a novel.
Yeah, I think the novel came out of my doctorate work when I started my research at the university here in Seattle. And I said I would really like to read way, way more than I am now, which is fantastic. You don't need to go into a program to do that. That's something you could sort of do at home. If you want to just take a year of your life and say, I'm going to read 100 books written from here to here, or all memoirs, or some sort of subject, and say, I'm going to read 100 of them. And then after I'm done, I'm going to say, this is what I learned. I mean, that's what the program was like, and it's just incredible how much reading just changes you in ways that is surprising. You don't quite know until you go back to the page and you're writing. And so the novel writing came out of all the things I wanted to say and all the research I was reading and finding that I felt was very difficult to find anywhere else. You know, historical events like the Fukushima Maru is even difficult to find.
This is the ferry
If you
boat?
were looking, right, if you were, yes, if you were looking for it, it's difficult to find. Even if you were looking for it in Korean and Japanese, in English, it's difficult to find. So those were the moments that I really wanted to bring out into narrative.
Okay, so what's next then? I mean, poetry, memoir, novel. Like, are you screenwriting now? Like, what's happening?
That's so funny you asked that. I had written the screenplay for the Pachinko television series while I was doing a lot of the work for the memoir and the novel. So I was doing that at the same time,
You mean
which
the
was
the
helpful.
the television series based on Min Jin Lee's novel?
Yes.
You're working on
And
that show?
oh, I finished it. I did the first season. Yeah.
You wrote the whole first season.
No, me and the writers' room wrote the whole first season, and we
Oh,
were each specifically given an episode. And so I did episode 4, which is sort of the really sad mother-daughter episode. So I felt really lucky to get a chance to meet all those writers and work on screenwriting.
that's awesome. And so
Yeah,
where does that air, that show?
that is on Apple TV.
Is it on now? I'm totally out of the
Yes,
loop. Okay. So yeah.
yes.
All right. Wow, that's exciting. I was totally like couple things. When I asked about Han, I got to admit, I didn't know that your doctoral thesis had been about Han.
Oh, okay.
When I asked about screenwriting, I had no idea that you had written for Pachinko, but it's I'm feeling good about myself. My instincts are bearing out here. So, in terms of your own work, like I know that obviously writing for Pachinko is to some extent your own work, but do you have ambitions to adapt your own work or do work for the screen that is generated solely by you or comes from you?
Oh, I mean, I think I'm open to anything that comes my way. I I learned a lot from that process. I learned a lot about what an adaptation is. It's a very different thing. It really has a very little connection with the original, and understanding what that process is like was important. And so going forward, if there was an adaptation, I think I would be better prepared for that.
Wow. So you're up in Seattle. You are celebrating the publication of this novel. You wrote for Pachinko. Is there anything currently in the works?
Oh, interesting. I'm right now I'm focusing on writing those love letters since I don't want to be too behind, and I would like to get to 700 soon. Yeah.
I like that as a like a bridge practice almost in between projects. Like it keeps you writing and it probably inspires you. And
Yeah.
I'm imagining it helps you sort of churn like psychologically and emotionally on your way to the next thing.
Yeah. And it teaches me a lot.
All right. Well, I might have you write me a letter. That's what I'm gonna. If you would, I'll let you write me
Yes.
one if you want to get to 700.
Of course.
But it's been wonderful to talk with you and to meet you. Congratulations on the Liberators. I'm very happy that we got to spotlight it in the book club this month, and I wish you well on whatever it is that comes next.
I'm so grateful for the Liberators being spotlighted this way. It really surprised me. I mean, there are so many wonderful books, authors out there, and many on the show you bring on. So I can't tell you what a huge surprise that was to me and a big honor. So thank you. Thank you for doing what you're doing now.